Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's special symposium held by the Sadat Chair. My name is Greg Ball. I'm the Dean of the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences here at the University of Maryland, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to today's event called Immigrant Stories. It's very appropriate that this event be today, which is Social Justice Day here at the campus, an event we started about 3 years ago in which we discussed different themes related to social justice. And I think immigration is one of the great challenges that any society faces, and it really tests the value system of how you can value your own, appreciate your own culture, but also welcome and appreciate, tolerate, embrace other cultures. And that continues to be a challenge for our species. Even in the United States, where we have a consensus that immigration has been fundamental to the success of the country, today we're still having a debate concerning the pros and cons of immigration and how it should be managed. And so this tension continues, and the resolution of this tension, in my mind, is going to be one of the most important things this country has to do in order to move forward with success and a healthy society. It's therefore wonderful that Professor Shibli Talhami, the Sadat Chair for Peace here at the University of Maryland, has sponsored today's event. Having a series of prominent people who went through the immigrant experience, talking about their experience, helping us to reflect on that and think about how we should learn from this, I think is just a wonderful event to have as part of Social Justice Day. So, welcome, and I invite Professor Talhami to come to the stage.
All right, welcome to our panelists. Let me just very briefly introduce them. And part of the reason why I'm not going to go through a long introduction is that I'm going to have them tell us their stories. Remember, we called this immigrant stories in part because we want to tell the stories of immigrants and then have a conversation about it. And so I'm not going to do a long introduction. Needless to say, each one is extraordinarily accomplished. But let me start with my colleague Nina Khrushcheva, who's a professor at the Graduate Program of International Affairs at the New School. She has written many books. She has been a voice in the public conversation. Many of you may have seen her on television or heard her commentary or read her op-eds. Incredibly thoughtful. I've always been a fan. We've been in touch over the years. And more importantly, with all the books that she has published, she still has a new book that just came out. And it is called In Putin's Footsteps, Searching for the Soul of an Empire Across Russia's 11 Time Zones. And it really gives a flavor of the complexity of Russia and how we don't deal with this issue adequately. This book with Jeffrey Taylor literally came out a few weeks ago, and it's available. Actually, we're going to have a book signing for those of you who are interested after this panel. Next to Nina is our own Wallace Loh, our president. Many of you know his biography, know his accomplishments, know his challenges that he has faced in many months, but many of you may not know the full story. Just like Nina, who was born in Moscow during the Cold War, and then found her way to this country. President Loh was born in Shanghai, China. Also, even just before the Cold War, or just about the Cold War was about to emerge, and then his family found its way to Peru and then came to this country. So it's a powerful story there. And Maria Otero, who is maybe known to many as a relentless advocate of human rights in this country and around the world, who served as Undersecretary of State for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights in the Obama administration. She also was a special representative, Obama's special representative for Tibetan issues. One other thing about Maria is she is a Terp. She actually went to the University of Maryland, studied at the University of Maryland, Really great to have you. Maria was born in Bolivia. And then, last but not least, my colleague and friend, Abdurrahim Fuqara, who heads Al Jazeera in the Americas, in both South and North America, and who was born in Marrakesh, Morocco. He and I have known each other for a long, long time. Normally, it's exactly the opposite way. He's interviewing me on Al Jazeera's weekly show, Min Washington. It's a 1-hour show, which gives the Arab world a flavor of what's happening in the United States. And so it's really representing America to the Arab world. And I have the pleasure of being his host almost once a month, it seems, sometimes even more frequently, depending on the issues. Abdurrahim has an interesting story, not only in terms of growing up in Morocco, but also, like President Lowe, going somewhere else before he came to America, and that is the UK. So thank you all for joining us. And let me start with just your stories. I have some, questions I want to probe. But if you could tell us your story about how you found your way here. And I mean, before I ask this question because, frankly, everybody has a different path to coming here. Some struggle more than others, some more natural than others, but it's always an interesting path. And I also want to say, especially because these are extraordinary people by any measure that we have on this panel, whether it's immigrants or not, whether it's Americans or internationals, by virtue of their accomplishments and visibility, I think that we should also recognize that there are many immigrants who are invisible, who have worked hard and contributed to America, who didn't quite become public figures, who contributed so much to this country. And so when we're thinking about immigrants, we're not only thinking about this kind of accomplishment that is visible and public accomplishment. And I feel like I have to say that because my wife and I were in Dearborn, Michigan, just a few weeks ago, less than a month ago. And we went to the Henry Ford Museum, and we saw, when the car industry started, all these immigrants that were being brought in, including a lot from the Middle East, Arab Americans, that's to this day strong, but from all over, who put sweat and blood into building the car industry to make it as great as it was. And this is the story of a lot of people who remain unnamed in terms of the public discourse, and they're great because they contributed. America is great not only because of people on this panel, but because of a lot of other immigrants who don't have the same recognition and acceptance. And by the way, all these workers whose stories we heard when we were visiting the car museum, they now have parents who are, in fact, people who would be here on this panel. And that, too, is really something, a story that has to be told. But we have those four on the stage. And I want to start with you, Nina, because your story is interesting. Obviously, it comes at a time when when Russia is to be a Russian American, at a time when we have a Russian American tension, has to be a story. So please start with the origins.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's very humbling to be here, and I'm very grateful to do this. Okay.
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Humbling to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. I feel like I don't deserve to be here, but here I am. Not because Russia is such a Darth Vader of contemporary foreign policy and politics, but that's, I guess, our fate. Being a Russian in this country is never easy. You're sometimes forgotten, as we were after 1991, and some Russianists complained about that, and I feel like that was a wonderful time. Nobody really cared that my name is Nina Khrushcheva in 1995. Well, not so much today. My story is simple, I think. It's I mean, thank you for saying it's interesting. I don't know how interesting it is. The Cold War was almost over. Mikhail Gorbachev was the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, but he was so non-communist, I think, social democrat, that he renamed himself into president, which is a little bit of an oxymoron in terms, because there was also a communist party at the same time. I guess that happens. I mean, it happens in China. But at the time, it was an unusual thing. And he also said, we really cannot dictate the world, the fates, if they don't want to be with us. It was during the fall of the Berlin Wall in '89. If they don't want to be with us, they should pick their own story. They should pick their own fate. And he said to the Soviets, it's a free country. You do whatever it is you want to do. And so I thought, oh, that's interesting. I'd like to see how it is to be a foreigner, because the Soviet Union, with all its diversity, was a homogeneous country. You don't travel, you really don't meet that many foreigners, so I wanted to see how it is to be somewhere else, to be a Russian somewhere else. And so I applied for graduate school in a variety of places. My first choice was Princeton University. I was lucky to be accepted to Princeton University. And here I am. I've been here since '91. I never lived in Russia because I still left the Soviet Union. It was 2 weeks before the Soviet Union collapsed. So every time when I introduce myself, I say, hi, I'm a former Soviet.
Yeah, and so if you can just tell us a little bit more about your growing up in the Soviet Union at a time when there was the Cold War, and how you grew up seeing America as on the other side, and particularly with the legacy of your family, because you have obviously, if you, and not only is a great-grandfather who was heading the Soviet Union at the time, but also who was, I understood in a way, an adoptive grandfather in practice, right, in your biography. So could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, thank you for this. So Nikita Khrushchev was my great-grandfather by blood and my grandfather by relations, because when my mother's parents, his granddaughter's parents, were killed and imprisoned during World War II, he adopted her as a daughter, he and Nina, who I named after. So that's kind of the origins of that story. The way I was growing up in the Soviet Union, I don't know how much of it is of interest. It is, in some ways, I guess, an interesting story because the name is big, but the growing up was very small, because I was born right when Nikita Khrushchev was ousted from being in charge of the Kremlin, and essentially became a persona non grata. So when I was growing up, there was no such thing as Nikita Khrushchev did anything. Sputnik, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Yuri Gagarin, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Meeting with John Kennedy, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So he really didn't exist, because that was the Soviet politics, is that you delete leaders that you are not you, the system deletes leaders that it is not happy with. So I grew up with a name that was also a non-existent name. I don't know how to explain it in 5 seconds or less, but everybody knew. But everybody knew that Khrushchev was a big name, and yet it was a name that was unpronounced. So I would come into school and be a Khrushchev, but we all pretended that we don't know who Khrushchev was. So it was a little interesting, more than interesting. So my growing up in the Soviet Union was, I knew I was a descendant of somebody who was very important, but we were not supposed to talk about it. So the only thing we talk about Khrushchev was at home in the kitchen, of how that system one day is going to collapse, and then Khrushchev will rise up and will take great place in history, which indeed happened after Mikhail Gorbachev, so we owe him a lot. Our family owes him a tremendous amount. In many ways, I think, and I will conclude my kind of growing up part with this, is that as horrible, I think, as it was for Khrushchev to be ousted and the family continuing with essentially place in history, place in society, because when Khrushchev was kicked out of the Kremlin, also every member of the family lost their jobs. My mother was a journalist, and her husband's name, Petrova, and her name was taken. I mean, she couldn't write anymore because even with her husband's name, there was a fear that she could be recognized as Khrushchev's daughter, and God forbid somebody who would read Pravda would think that Khrushchev's daughter is published on the pages of the pristine pages of Pravda. So she stopped being a journalist. Other members of the family lost their names, lost their jobs. But I think what the good thing is that, first of all, Khrushchev wasn't killed. And he himself, when he was ousted in 1964, before he left the room, and his last words were, "I am really proud that today I am ousted by mere voting," because only 10 years before that he would have gone to Gulag or even killed. So that was his great achievement. Achievement for us is that he didn't get killed. Even they lost the jobs, we didn't lose apartments. Our life was rather privileged nonetheless, but also, and I'm very grateful, I think, to the Communist Party for kicking him out, although I'm sure that probably is not shared by my family members, is that because we were a nobody, only with a name that was not supposed to be mentioned, we actually became human beings. Because people in power, especially those who come out of high positions in the Kremlin, I'm sure you've never met anybody. You've never met Brezhnev's children, you've never met even Gorbachev's children, you've never met Yeltsin's children, so the only person you're ever going to meet are the Khrushchev descendants, because we are the human beings. And so that's our story and my story of hopefully becoming a better human in the United States.
Well, thanks so much. That was so interesting. And I want to come back to that a little bit later on when we talk about identity. But I want to go to President Loh, and if you could hand him the microphone. The question, Nina said she actually she never lived in Russia. She lived in the Soviet Union and came to America. And in a way, your story is the opposite almost, in the sense that you were born in China, but you never really lived in communist China, or maybe a little bit. So could you tell us a little bit more about, if you have any memory at all, or at least something about the family roots in China and how you ended up in Peru?
Well, Shibli, thank you so much for organizing this panel, and I'm honored to be with fellow hyphenated Americans on this stage. If I may preface my short remarks about my background, this topic for me all of a sudden has become very personal, because last spring, the director of the FBI testified in Congress and said, in effect, that all persons of Chinese descent should be suspect. I was outraged by that. I wrote him a letter, and I said, I thought this kind of racial profiling went out with World War II, when Japanese Americans, who were very loyal Americans, died for our country, were interned in camps. Well, 2 weeks later, I get an invitation to go to a high security conference in the FBI, in which I learned, or I heard the FBI version of why China is an existential threat to this country. And they may be, but still, the notion that every Chinese American should be suspect is, I found, profoundly antithetical to the values of this country. So how did I get to where I am? My father became ambassador to Peru, and so my older brothers and sisters did not want to leave China. They were going to school, so I was the youngest. They took me along. I was about a year old, and we went to Peru. My father thought, well, it'll be a 3-year stint, and we go back to China, go back to Shanghai. But we were pretty well off, or so I'm told. And then the revolution occurred, and we got separated. And my father had to seek political asylum in Peru because if he had gone back, he was serving the wrong party, the Nationalist Party, who lost. So for them, in retrospect, it was a dramatic fall in social status from being an ambassador to being refugees with no money. And we opened a little grocery store where my parents worked literally 14, 15 hours a day. And so did I, starting in 5th grade. And so when I got to my senior year, my parents said to me, Wallace, there's not much opportunity for you here. So here's $300, our life savings, and we hope you can end up in the United States. I did not speak much English at that time. I went to the local American embassy, and I found only 3 college catalogs. One was from Vassar College, and I wrote to them, and they said, well, thank you for your interest, but we're a women's college. You see, I didn't read carefully, and I didn't have my dictionary with me. And there was another small school called St. Mary's of the Woods College in Indiana, and they wrote back and said, this is a college to prepare nuns. And the third college was a little school in Iowa. And they said, you know, well, we can offer you a small scholarship, $500, and we can provide you with a part-time job, because I had no money. Work washing pots and pans every night, 3 nights, about 3 hours, 7 nights, and you get 1 free meal. So with the $300 of my parents' life savings, I, a Latino Asian, my first language, well, I don't know what my first language is, because I speak Chinese with a Spanish accent, I speak Spanish with a Chinese accent, and I speak English with a combination of both. So I arrived in this tiny little school, Grinnell College, we locally called Grim Hell, because it was in the middle of a cornfield. And to make the long story short, that is when I discovered, or I learned about the heartland of this country. I've been back to Iowa ever since, as the provost of the University of Iowa. And whereas I'm not so sure that I fit in politically, I can tell you from experience that the people in Iowa were some of the kindest, most generous people I have ever met. They would drive up their cars to where I was living. I was living in the basement of somebody's house, and I was charging $1 to wash their cars. And some of the cars were very clean. And until I realized they were trying to give me a job. And faculty members who took the time to teach me English. And fast forward a little bit, I spent 1 summer in Sunflower County, Mississippi, doing civil rights work, registering people to vote. And that's when, of course, I first experienced what was reading in my classes, when 2 other kids and I, both of them from Chicago, a white guy and an African-American woman, and I, in Latation, spent the summer doing voter registration drive. And I remember one day wanting to go to church. I mean, we were innocent. I mean, we were 19 years old, 20 years old. And then we were turned away. And I was shocked. But of course, I've read about it. But it's one thing to read about segregation, it's another to experience it personally. I decided right then and there, I want to go to law school. Anyway, I graduated, I applied to law school. Every single law school I applied to turned me down. So, all right, that's fine. So I applied to graduate school, I got accepted, and pursued a PhD. And in the course of pursuing a PhD, I spent a year and a half, almost 2 years. I got a fellowship to go to University of Louvain in Belgium. And I will never forget this. I arrived in my little, this was 1968, I think, you know, the Paris Revolution, with the French students were revolting. And I drive into Leuven in this dilapidated Volkswagen. There were thousands of students out in the square. And they were singing in Dutch, but I could recognize the tune. It was We Shall Overcome. So I stopped the car because I couldn't go any further. It was blocked by all these students. And I said, so what is this about? You're singing the American Civil Rights Anthem. We shall overcome. He says, yes, we are doing the civil rights demonstration. I said, what are you demonstrating about? Because we want the French-speaking, the Walloons, to get out of here. I said, wait a second. You're singing an American integration song in support of separate but equal? That's when I became interested in issues of immigration and cultural differences. Well, then to fast forward, I got my PhD. I never forgot my desire to go become a lawyer, so I applied to the same law schools that turned me down, about 6 or 7 of them, and they all admitted me. So what happened? What happened was affirmative action came to this country. And so the same schools that turned me down, they all wanted me. And I may call you Anna, right? Because you work for President Clinton. I have to tell you the story. So I had decided to go to Harvard Law School. So I called Yale to tell them I was turning them down to go to Harvard. And the admissions office said, well, you know, have you informed them yet? No, but I thought I would inform you first. And they said, we would like you to talk to this young woman student who's an intern in our office. And just talk to her. I said, fine. And so this woman comes up to the phone. She's a student there. And she introduces herself as Hillary Rodham. I was mesmerized. I have never met somebody as persuasive as this woman was. I immediately changed my mind, told Harvard I was not going, and changed to Yale. The reason I also mention all of this is because 2 years ago, I was invited to go back to Yale. When I went to Yale, in the entire law school, there were only 3 Asian Americans, or 3 Asians, period. I was one of them. When I went there a year ago, I was invited to give a speech. I was stunned. I was told there was something called the Asian American Law Student Association, and there were 150 students out of 700. How times have changed. And so that's basically my background, and it has profoundly shaped my views of the world, and I can only say, you fast forward, I'm today the president of a major public research university. Who would have thought that a 15-year-old coming to this country with $200 in his pocket, the life savings of his parents, speaking hardly any English, would be the president of a major public university in this country? It is not about me. It is about the opportunities that this country provides. We don't always live fully up to our values, but having lived and taught in South America, in Asia, in Europe, at least we have those values, even though we fall short of them.
Well, this was wonderful to hear. And you know, I have known Wallace Loh practically from the day he and Barbara arrived on campus. And I have never heard this story. And that was really kind of in a way I feel sad about that, because I think we all have a story that informs a lot about what we do. And this came across, and thank you for sharing it with us. I know it's not easy to share personal stories for a variety of reasons, because we want to feel we're just completely professional and feel like Nina must have felt it worked for her when her great-grandfather didn't matter in the Soviet Union, or her identity. But these stories do matter. They do inform us. Maria, I know that you were born in Bolivia, and somehow through a path took you to the University of Maryland, of all things, to study here. So could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Certainly. And thank you for having me here. I feel like I'm totally at home, because studied here. I'm not going to tell you when, but I used to park in parking lot A and run from the Francis Scott Key building to, which is really where I spent most of my time. I love this university. The impact it had on me was life-changing. It was transformative. And I think played an incredible role in enabling me to even dream of what I could be. I did arrive in this country when I was 12 years old. My family moved here from Bolivia. I spoke no English when I arrived into about the 7th grade. I think they had us do 6th grade. Again, I'm one of 9 children, good Catholic family. None of us were asked if we wanted to move anywhere. You just did what your parents told you. And when we arrived at the Catholic school, I knew 2 words in English. I mean, we're so badly trained. And there were no Latins there, so there was really no one speaking Spanish. I knew how to say pencil, and the nuns in Bolivia had taught us, I remember, pencil and rubber for eraser. So I would say to the boy next to me, could I borrow your rubber, please? This was not the best way to be able to try to integrate as a young 6th, 7th grader. Learning the language is one of the most difficult struggles that you have to undertake. And because I arrived right at that time of adolescence, perhaps the most important thing for me was to assimilate into the American culture, which now we think about how assimilation is really not what we should try to do. We should not be swallowed up, but the concept of integrating ourselves with our full, diverse culture, with our traditions, with what we bring to a society that will enrich it, as well as enable us to learn from it, is something you don't realize at the time. At the time, I just wanted blue eyes and blonde hair, with all those Irish young kids I studied with, and I desperately wanted to belong. Everything my family did was wrong. If you're a Bolivian on Saturdays, your mom fixes a huge meal, you lay the tablecloth and you sit around the table and you have rice and chicken and all these other things. And I remember coming to my mom after I made a few friends and saying, Mom, you know, they do it differently in my friend's house. The mom just puts a pot to boil and they put hot dogs in there. And then somebody, you know, the kids just come, pick up a hot dog and eat. Why can't we do that? And so, you know, your effort to assimilate is there everywhere, to become part of what you are. And it really is a struggle. It's very, you do feel the loneliness as a child or as an adolescent of being in a different place. And you also realize that only later, that when you move to another country, our living room in Washington, which is where we moved, might as well have been in La Paz, Bolivia, for years. Because what was happening in our own country, the politics of our own country, the crisis, the conflicts that occurred, were the center of our lives. And only really Bolivians and other Latin Americans came through our living room, and this is what we discussed. In 1963, Martin Luther King was in Washington, D.C. in the Great March of Washington. We had no idea who he was. We did not know any of the issues related to the march, and we didn't care very much. We were much more concerned with what President Ovando at the time was doing to President Barrientos. So I think one of the factors that is part of being an immigrant is that you know so little about the environment that you're in that you retain that force, that pull, that it still gives you your sense of identity. I went to the University of Maryland, in part because I was one of 9 children, and I lived in Maryland. And so there wasn't really very much option. My parents, nor we, didn't really know that you applied to schools. So I didn't really apply to anywhere but the University of Maryland. And my parents said, "You're a young woman, you're going to the university. You want to live where?" You live with your family. You live in your house with your mom and your dad, because it was inconceivable that you would live in a dorm. And additionally, the resources for us were very limited. So I commuted to the University of Maryland. That's why parking lot A is so familiar to me. And I worked probably 20, 25 hours in order to be able to pay tuition, which at the time, was much more commensurate with what you could earn. The University of Maryland, for me, was a place where I think I started to see the world and to understand it. And what happened to me at the University of Maryland was that I found mentors. I found professors. I studied English literature, specifically British Romantic literature. My professors in the English department pushed me and said to me, one of them said to me one time, Professor John Howard, he said, "You know, Maria, if you keep your grades up, you can be a teaching assistant here, and you can get your master's here." I had never heard of a master's. I did not know that graduate school existed. And so this idea of being able to keep expanding really happened to me here at the University of Maryland. And I was one of those teaching assistants who taught English 101, which you all remember, all your English 101 teachers. And my time here enabled me to develop enough of a sense of self that it also allowed me to enter into into the kind of identity crisis, if you will, that you enter when you belong to 2 different societies. Who am I? Where do I belong? Am I going to live here, or am I going to go back to my country? Who should I be? This notion that you don't really know where you belong. And at the time, as I was finishing my master's thesis on John Keats, his poetic development, there was a coup in Chile, and General Pinochet took over the country, demolished a democratically elected government of President Allende, and Chile, which was next to my country, went into a period of tortures, of disappearances, of horrific events that stopped me short and made me think, wait a minute, where do I come from? Why am I studying British Romantic literature when I am really from Bolivia? And in Bolivia, 80% of the population is hungry and has no opportunity. Where should I be? What should I do? And this really took me from my beloved British Romantic literature to coming from the humanities into the political sciences and economics. And then I proceeded to study and get another master's in international studies that then allow me to do the work that I am doing now. But the concept of being an immigrant has remained for me as central to who I am. And at some point, I arrived at an acceptance that I don't have, that I can provide a great deal to this country and not just feel as if I'm a second-class citizen, and that I can represent the many, many immigrants, especially now from my part of the world, especially from Central America, who don't have a voice, who can't speak, who suffer illiteracy in their own language and then have to come here. And so the issue of migration and immigration has also become very central to my own life. And I think, developed a sense that when you are giving an opportunity to be a president, to be a writer, in my case, to become the first Latina Undersecretary of State in the history of the Department of State, that I have a responsibility. And that I am given the opportunity to also provide some sense of leadership, some role modeling, especially to women, and address the issue of gender, which has also been one that I've worked on throughout my life, and help minority women, immigrants and otherwise, be able to create opportunity to achieve more equity and to move forward. So let me stop right there, but I did want to tell you a little bit about the University of Maryland and how important it was.
Well, it's
for
great,
me.
and we'll come back to some of that as well. So, Abdurrahim, I mean, I would like to hear your story, obviously, about leaving Morocco and why and how you ended up ultimately in the U.S. via the U.K. But I hope you could address one of the themes that comes out of all this, which is you are a visible person in the Arab world. You're an American now. Your roots are in Morocco. You have a story to tell about how you got here. But you are, when we sometimes think of immigrants as being a bridge, in a way, your voice here in America is being heard back home because of what you do, and particularly on Al Jazeera, broadcasting in Arabic to not just Morocco, but elsewhere in the Arab world. And in a way, you have to be frustrated with the narrow prism through which people here view the Middle East, but also in some ways the way people in the Middle East view America. And so how do you deal with that?
Well, I mean, thank you for the invitation, first of all. I mean, the fact that I'm here, part of this panel, there's something quintessentially American, I would say, about it, in terms of the recognition that America and Americans give to people like us who came from a different history and a different geography.
Closer, yeah.
There's something quintessentially American about us sitting here, having come from a different history and a different geography. You know, the journey of an immigrant is always an arduous one. The journey of an immigrant who succeeds in a new country is even more arduous. But as I said, there is recognition at the end of the process for us here, and there is no recognition of success that exceeds the American recognition of success. In other words, you're not as successful as you should be until you're successful in America. That's the general assumption. Now, I got here, if you allow me to say, since you're asking us to give this a personal touch, I got here for many different reasons, but I always go back to the origin of the reason, which is my parents. And I have to give them recognition. I give them recognition every single day. My father taught me how to read and write. by virtue
In Marrakesh.
in Marrakesh, yes, Morocco, by virtue of actually taking me to school that first day. I was a little boy. I'll never forget that. We don't forget that moment, any one of us. But you need more than being able to read and write, obviously, to be successful. You need somebody to teach you how to dream. That was my mother's job. She taught us how to dream. And my father passed away some 20 years ago. I always, when I go back to Morocco, I go and I visit his grave because I just want to remind myself of what he did for me. My mother, she's ailing now, but I call her almost on a daily basis because I want to remind myself of how she taught me to dream. And part of what she taught me to dream about, believe it or not, was actually to come to America when I was a little boy. Now, she had a lot of tools to work with to teach me that, how to dream about that. One of them is that as little boys growing up in Morocco, generation after generation, we still are taught that Morocco was the first country to recognize the independence of the United States from the British Crown. Later on, I found out that the Dutch also teach their children the same thing, but that's a different story. I actually, since we're talking about history, I found out later on in life that the story of Morocco with the United States goes even deeper than that. One of the first explorers after the New World was discovered by Christopher Columbus or whoever ended up discovering it. That's a subject for a different occasion. But one of the early explorers was actually from the region of Azammour on the Atlantic, on the Moroccan Atlantic coast, and he was sold as a slave to a Portuguese explorer who brought him to the New World. He's known, more commonly known as Estevanico, and I understand he's buried somewhere in Houston, Texas. Now, the other reason, or the other tool that my mother had to work with, she had American soft power. I mean, we watched a lot of Little House on the Prairie, Dallas, and you know, all those things that can be seen as superficial or negative, but they do shape your perception of a particular part of the world, in this case, of the United States. But there's a more profound reason, which is part of the dream that my mother taught us, which is that my eldest brother came to the United States when he finished high school. He was a young kid, and he was placed with a family in Wisconsin. And you can imagine the kind of stories that he went back to Morocco with from the United States. And that helped substantially and practically shape our dream and our perception of the United States and wanting to come to it. And then I found myself in the United Kingdom. I was very young, and at that time, I loved the United Kingdom. I spent many wonderful years there. It's a great country, great culture, great history. But when I went, the United Kingdom was going through a very, very, very rough patch. Nothing was working. Maggie Thatcher had just become Prime Minister. The country had gone through the Falklands War, or the Malvinas, as the Argentinians, so we don't offend anyone, call it. And nothing was working in the UK at that time. The health service was not working, the trains were not working, the miners were on strike up and down the country. It was just a terrible time in the history of the United Kingdom. Many Europeans referred to it at that time as the sick man of Europe. And there was a joke at that time. Maggie Thatcher had become friends with Ronald Reagan here in the United States. And the Brits were so disaffected. I was following this stuff. All this stuff was percolating inside my head, obviously. The Brits were so disaffected, they were so unhappy with their own situation that a joke was doing the rounds at that time, saying, what's the difference between the United States and Britain? And the answer was the United States had Ronald Reagan, Johnny Cash, and Bob Hope. the UK had Thatcher, no hope and no cash. And these things, at the time they seemed fleeting in my consciousness or subconsciousness, as the case may have been. But they made me think a lot about, I'm in the UK, there's another world which somebody else had taught me how to dream about getting to. And I joined the BBC later on. I was on assignment in Kuwait. I got a call from somebody in Boston. I was in BBC Radio at that time. I got a call for somebody who was in Boston working on a co-production of the BBC and WGBH Boston. And he said, "Hey, Abdurrahim, we have a vacancy in Boston. Do you want to come?" I said, "Brian, I need to think about this." So click, and then I said, "What do I need to think about? There's nothing to think about. This is a great opportunity. Let me go for it." So I called him back, and that's how it all happened. That's how I ended up in the United States, initially on secondment from the BBC for a couple of years, and then I went back to London. I remember trekking through Leicester Square one morning after going back, and I looked up, and it was grey, raining. Leicester Square was packed. You had to
Sounds
elbow
like
your
Ithaca.
way through the crowds. And then I said, "What am I doing here?" I just left a city where even when it's snowing, it's sunny, Boston. And then I decided to come back. Then later on, I joined Al Jazeera, and I am where I am now. The issue is this, for me, the success. The success is, yes, of course, the success is what I'm doing now for Al Jazeera, and, having risen to where I am. But for me, the real success is, as an Arab from Morocco, sitting in the capital of the most powerful nation, maybe in human history, a nation that affects people everywhere in the world, sometimes down to their daily bread, certainly does so when it comes to the Middle East and North Africa. And I'm sitting here on top of this mountain, watching history unfold day after day at the crossroads of American lives and Arab lives in North Africa and the Middle East. And some days I wake up in the morning and I pinch myself. Wow, I consider myself so fortunate that I am in the nation's capital, observing the crossroads of the Middle East and the United States. And it's just a wonderful place to be, if, to circle back to the point that you were talking about, if you can be dispassionate about observing it. Because if you get emotionally tangled up in the politics of the US and the Middle East, it can be a very depressing place to be. But if you can give yourself enough emotional distance from that and just observe it from up here, there's no other place like it. If that's what you call success, that is definitely what I call success.
Well, thanks very much for the story. I'm an immigrant too, and I also came to this country with $150, and my parents just had faith that was going to be enough for me to put me through school, and clearly, like all of us, struggle through questions of identity throughout. But there are moments when I felt that I belong more than others. And I'm not talking about politically, because we focus a lot on the politics. We're talking about fitting socially, fitting culturally. And sometimes it's deliberate that it happens, the memory. But when you talked about the kind of how fortunate you feel to be on top of the world, essentially, and how fortunate that we could be talking about it in Washington, you and me, talking to the rest of the Arab world from Washington, which everybody wants to hear. And I did have moments throughout my journey when I felt like it was extraordinary, and the first, many of them along the way. But particularly when I first went to advise the United States mission at the United Nations during the end of the just as the end of the Cold War was ending, and was given top secret security clearance. I'm an immigrant. I'm an Arab American. I come from a small village. My family still lives there, and I'm given access to the nation's top secrets. I am sitting there behind the United States ambassador to the United Nations at the Security Council, looking at everything that has taken place, and I am accepted to participate in the decisions that were critical at that time. I think that's the moment when I felt I belonged. And certainly, there are many other moments like that. But I have to say, just as Wallace Lowe said, this is what makes this country great. And I don't know that there is another place like it. But it's an imperfect place. And it's an imperfect place, and we're going through a crisis right now, including the crisis on immigrants, including the crisis of defining immigrants as the other, because that is the worst part of this conversation. It's not just about do you support immigrants or not, because it's given that this country is mostly made up of descendants of immigrants and immigrants. It's an extraordinary thing to create this notion that immigrant is the other against which an American is being defined. And that transmits itself in a process. And sometimes I certainly feel American. If you ask me, what are you first? You know, I'm a professor, I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a Marylander, I'm a citizen of the United States, I'm a citizen of the world. But there are often places when you're in the middle of the debate when everybody is looking at you strictly by your ethnicity or your origin. And you can't escape that. And sometimes it's unconscious, and it happens in conversations where, despite the fact that I have not only served at the U.S. mission at the UN, I have actually advised every single administration, from George Herbert Walker Bush through Obama, with top secret clearance twice throughout those periods. And therefore, I'm in a position, in a way, to speak as an American, even officially. And yet, I find myself in places where I go that people think of me as the other, as a foreigner. And we haven't overcome that. There's the greatness side, and there is the other. And I, therefore, want to use that as a way of asking you, Nina, because you're an American, and you are a Soviet. Okay, you're not Russian. You're Soviet.
I'm a Russian passport.
No,
Russian
I understand. And now we're in the middle of a very tense relationship with Russia, where obviously Russia is being demonized, and we're looking at Russia through a very narrow prism, or what we think of Putin, or what we think of Russia as doing in our election. And how does that impact you, in how you see yourself in the American conversation, or how you think other people relate to you in the American conversation? It's bound to show itself up in the way you're thinking about it. And in a way, I would like that to be a way for you to link up about your new book, because the new book, I mean, what happens in the conversations when there's a crisis, like after 9/11, the crisis toward Arabs and Muslims, where Americans are looking at big categories of people through a narrow prism, the prism of terrorism, or the prism of Putin, or the prism of whatever it is. Yeah, and I know that this new book, in which you're showing the complexity and diversity across Russia, 11 time zones, and you're telling this story. And is this one of the reasons why you were driven to do that, I wonder?
Well, a little bit. Thank you. I actually like being the other, to remind my fellow Americans that other doesn't mean bad, that Russian doesn't mean bad, the Chinese doesn't mean bad. The fact that there is a whole history of the Cold War doesn't mean, and I'm a Khrushchev, doesn't mean that Khrushchev speaking through me with his anti-American pronouncements, because often you encounter this kind of simplistic understanding of the Russians, the Chinese, the Mexicans. We've been hearing a lot about people from the White House lately, how they are rapists and murderers because they are not white necessarily. So I am, if I may say so, I just actually shove into people's faces that I'm a Russian, and so let them come to me and tell me that Putin is a Darth Vader and, you know, how dare the Russians do what they do. And then, of course, I say, well, let's look at American history, not that I'm defending the president and the Kremlin, but why don't you just get a little bit off your high horse and let's have a conversation about who does what in foreign policy. I was talking about my book recently at the Montclair Book Festival, and I was told, you know, Putin is doing horrible things to women in Russia. There's really, the rights of women are being highly, highly jeopardized, and, you know, what are the Russians doing with those abortion laws and whatnot? And it's like, wait a minute, you're an American man, and you're telling me that there are problems with women's rights in Russia. Thank you. Thank you. And there are problems with abortion in Russia, in America, you're telling me. So I take pride in having those confrontational conversations. I teach propaganda, so this comes naturally to me. Thank you very much. I do argue, I mean, something that all of you mentioned. We try not to be ideological. I love Republicans as much as I've loved the Democrats, and Fox News is my favorite TV channel just because you want to know what the other side does. And I also want to say hello to Maria because my degree was in comparative literature. I was comparing Victorian literature. I was comparing Charles Dickens and Nikolai Gogol, the Russian writer, and because Americans was just so wrong about the post-communist reality, about Boris Yeltsin and what he does and whether he's a true Democrat. And in a much smaller level, I was not, you know, in any way was thinking that I was saving humanity. I felt that I had to write op-eds to explain to Americans how complex Russia is. Not that it helped, but I tried, I did my best. The book that I just finished with a colleague, I just wrote with a colleague who is an American writer who lives in Moscow, so we flipped. I'm a Russian living in New York, and my identity, by the way, is a New Yorker rather than an American, because I am a quintessential New Yorker from East Village. Don't drag me away from First Avenue. I will not make it above 14th Street. So that is important to me, and so we went across Russia. What we did, we went from, because as you know, we don't have a map, but Russia is a big country. One part of it is essentially in Germany, what used to be Prussian city, German city of Königsberg, now Kaliningrad, on the border with Poland and Lithuania. And another side is on the Pacific Ocean. You remember when Sarah Palin memorably said that she's seeing, she's seeing Putin in her backyard. So we went to that backyard and said hello to Sarah Palin right there. So Russia is a big country, and I think what we try to do is to show that, in fact, Russia is much bigger than the Kremlin, and only Americans would think, no offense, that the Kremlin takes all. It doesn't. Putin doesn't take all. And so we wanted to show that the country is part Europe, on the border with China, on the border with Mongolia, on the border with Japan, on the border with on the Arctic Circle. And so to show what it is, Russia, today under Putin, but also how history plays into contemporary political environment. And one of the things that when we returned, it took only a month and a half to travel all across Russia, 6,000 miles all across. Big, but it takes, it's actually quite comfortable, because one of the things that Putin did, he made the country comfortable. Russia, the Soviet Union was never comfortable, Russia was never comfortable. He made it comfortable. There's a lot of problems, but people do live that they live now better than they've ever lived before. Not that it doesn't excuse Putin in any way, and not that one of 5 Russians actually now want to leave the country. Comfort or not, you want to have a future, and that's what Putin does not offer. He does offer the present with a lot of, with a big dose of the past. But when we came back, people were asking me how it was, and I was thinking, what can I tell them? I mean, there's a lot to tell, but one response that I had is, if I were Putin, I think I am God, and he thinks he's God.
Wallace, I just want to ask you a question more about where we are now here as a nation. I mean, this is a theme that we obviously is coming up in terms of what makes America great, and part of it is this diversity, and of which immigrants are part of the story. But we now are facing not only this backlash, and we saw the divide, it's an unbelievable divide in America, but we see the rise of nativism. Just to the backdrop of this diversity issue. And not just here, obviously. We're seeing it in many parts of the world, including parts of Europe. What's the answer?
I don't have an answer. But I can offer my perspective on it. I would begin with the observations of that French aristocrat, Alexis de Tocqueville, who in the mid-19th century wrote that classic, Democracy in America. And I think, you know, when I use the word classic, I don't use it in the sense that Mark Twain used the word, a book that everybody quotes and nobody reads. It's a classic of a book that stands the test of time. And one of the things that de Tocqueville observed about American democracy, he says, what makes America great is not because somehow America is more enlightened than others. Rather, it's because the people in America come together, recognize the faults of this country, and they try to correct them. Now, when I think about that, and I see the incredible polarization in the country today, from my perspective, throughout the 20th century, up to throughout the 1950s, for example, the model of this country was assimilation. It was a melting pot. People from different races, religions, and faiths and backgrounds, they were supposed to all meld together. A nation of homogenized Americans. Starting roughly in the 1960s, which is when I came to this country, that paradigm started to shift. It was no longer about assimilation, forgetting about your backgrounds, but rather about multiculturalism, celebrating the diversity of this country. But the question that was never addressed, so the metaphor is that of a mosaic. These different tiles all shining brightly and differently, and the question is what holds those tiles together? So we go from, at least in my view, from assimilation to multiculturalism to today, tribalism. The defining emotion of today is not about hope. It's not about gratitude for what this country offers. The defining emotion is tribal contempt from people with different views. Distrust, incivility. In other words, the mosaic metaphor is a mosaic that's breaking down. And the question is, well, what can you do about it? I have no idea what you can do about it, but this is what I would offer. Many countries in the world are united by religion, by land, by faith, What unites this very multicultural, very diverse country are not those attributes. Rather, it's a commitment to certain core values that define our identity and our destiny. Values that have to do with fairness, equal opportunity, freedom of expression. And you would say, well, these are constitutional values, these are legal values. And I say, no, they're more than that. These are civic virtues that make possible a thriving, pluralistic society. And these are not values that one is born with. They have to be taught. And when we have this kind of a polarized country, all I can say is it falls on us as educators to do something about it. I really believe that democracy has to be reborn in every generation. And the midwife of that rebirth is education. Because, for example, here at the University of Maryland, we always say that our mission is to prepare students for jobs and for life. What about preparing our students to become responsible citizens in a democracy, who know how to live rightly in a free society? Those are the civic virtues that must be taught, and civics is no longer taught in this country. And let me just conclude by saying this. When I became an American citizen, I went through this ceremony, and I was given this little red, white, and blue pamphlet, Welcome to United States Citizenship. So I was perusing through this pamphlet, and they talk about all these wonderful rights that I would enjoy as an American citizen. But what struck me is not what it said, it's what it did not say. It talked about my rights as a new citizen. It didn't say a word about my responsibilities to my new country. You cannot have rights without responsibilities. You cannot have freedom without obligations. And you look at the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, they talk about all the rights that we talk about, but they also talk about your responsibility for the general welfare. So how do we inculcate this notion that, yes, we are all different, yet, yes, we have spent 200 and how many years? 242 or so years trying to form a more perfect union. How do we have unity in diversity? One form from many, a pluribus unum. My generation, the baby boom generation, helped diversify this country. It is up to the millennial generation and the Z generation to find out how to unify this country. Unify not on the basis of race and religion and so on and so forth, but on the basis of a fundamental commitment and acting out on these fundamental values which emphasize the oneness of humankind.
Thank you. So we're going to take a few more minutes. I want to give a chance to Maria and Abdurrahim to make remarks on this as well.
Just a brief, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Just brief remarks, because I think you have covered it so very well. And when you were asked, what's the answer? What can we do? I am reminded that I am an immigrant, but I'm also an American. I am from this country. And as an Undersecretary of State, I traveled to maybe 55, 56 countries. And I never thought how proud I would be to represent the United States in the rest of the world. And I think part of that reason of that pride was because the administration that I was representing, the Obama administration, spent so much of its time trying to define and to play out the very values that are at the core of what this country is. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the sense of fairness, of equity, of dignity of each human being. And a lot of the work in diplomacy engaged us in thinking and playing out those very values. And and having a president who recognized that we had so much more work to do in order to be able to attain it in this country. I'll give you one quick example. One of the issues I covered was trafficking in persons. That absolutely horrible way in which especially young girls are sold into prostitution and are raped and are under bondage just to be able to make money for people. When Hillary Clinton came in as Secretary of State, she said, that's going on in this country too. We are also doing that, whether it's in Brooklyn or in Chicago, and we must recognize that we are also part of the problem and that we have to put in place the things that will help this issue addressed. So part of the solution to the tribalism, to the polarization that we are facing in this country is to elect the leaders that will give us the vision and will provide the path so that we can focus on these issues rather than on the issues that will divide us or will create the type of discrimination and the type of hatred that is being worked on as we're seeing under the Trump administration. So part of who we put forth as leaders as those that are going to govern this country presents to the rest of the world who we are. We know, we all travel overseas, and we know the kind of questions that the rest of the world is asking about the United States. And we know the questions they have about, well, tell me a little bit more about the American public, that we have this gentleman as president who is insulting every country around the world and is creating a kind of opening in this country for extremism and for racial inequality, and as you say, tribalism to come forth. So that gives us as Americans much room to think about. We need to be able to put leaders at every level within this system, this democratic system, in positions that are going to support the values that this country is based on. And we don't have it right now.
Thank you. Earlier I made a reference to my eldest brother. He's very funny, great sense of humor. I was talking to him yesterday over the phone. I was at the airport in Mexico City, waiting for my flight.
Closer.
And suddenly he heard an announcement, and he said, "Where are you?" I said, "I'm in Mexico." He said, "Mexico? Hurry on back to the US before they erect that wall." And you know, the issue with immigration is that you can erect all the walls you want. In the end, people, whether they are starved in their stomach, in their heart, or in their mind, for whatever they're starved for, they will find a way to get to the destination they want to get to. I mean, I'm thinking not just about the wall between the United States and Mexico as an example. I'm also thinking about the Mediterranean between Africa and Europe. When you find young immigrants, not just from Morocco, from as far afield in sub-Saharan Africa as the Congo, walked all the way up to the Mediterranean. They've come from Iraqi Kurdistan. They've come from all over the place. And you tell them, these waters are shark infested. And they say, you know what? Still want to give it a chance. And they give it a chance. Sometimes they make it, sometimes they don't. And the issue is that the point I'm trying to make is that the issue of immigration, it's a multilateral effort. Only a multilateral effort can deal with it, because the problem exists. People want to come, they want to leave their countries in mass for a particular reason. You have to address that particular reason, see in what way you can help. You're never going to find the magical solution to end that problem, but at least you have to find a way to think about how you can reduce it. But one thing that one thing I personally, I don't want to speak for anybody else, but one thing that I always remind myself of when I think of immigration, and that is that we have all come from somewhere at some point. You know, the issue of nativism, we have all come from somewhere. You can go as far back in human history as you like. You will always find people who come from somewhere else. And you know, that helps keep it in perspective. No one is suggesting that countries, for example, the United States, should open up the gates and let people flood in at will. But the issue is that it's very important for people to remember that even people here in the United States, they came from somewhere at a particular point in time. Even the people who are waving the flag of nationalism or white supremacy or whatever flag they were, originally they came from somewhere. And they came from somewhere. Why? Because some of them were starved in their stomachs, some of them were starved for freedom in their hearts, some of them were starved for new ideas in their minds. But to just pull the curtain and say, we need to close the borders, you can close them if you like. People will dig under the wall, people will swim through shark-infested seas to get to where they want to get when they feel they have to do it, and people are willing to risk it. If I make it, great, I'll live and maybe I'll become successful like we have become successful here in the United States. But if I don't, at least I have tried. That's the thinking. But to think that as one government you can solve it, it's not going to work. It's a collective effort.
Well, thank you so much. Well, let me end with a thought. And that is, you know, this is obviously a painful moment for America. It's a painful moment for democracy. It's a painful moment for the values that attracted us to this country and the values that we have raised our children on. But I, you know, like what Abdul Rahim said earlier, counseled, put the emotions of the moment away. It's hard, especially for us who are activists on this issue, who preach this issue, who live this issue, who teach this issue. It's really hard to detach yourself. But for a moment, detach yourself and look a little bit at the macro level. And what you see is more good, and what you see is a path forward. And I say this even in the polling that I presented here, one of which showed this deep polarization, the tribalism, the identity politics. But when you probe deeper into what people really think about issues like the issue that we looked at, family separation, where people are not going to fall into this tribalist divide, and even more in some of the issues that we have pulled over the past several years. In this era where racism seems to be the norm, where we've had a documented rise in racist incidents, whether it's Islamophobic incidents or anti-Semitic incidents or anti-black incidents. There's been a documented rise in those incidents. That seems to frighten us so deeply to think that maybe America is becoming more racist. When you probe deep down, it's actually quite the opposite. This is a moment where the racist and the people who are acting are empowered. And what we see is we're feeling the empowerment and the intensity of that fringe minority in America. In fact, what we see exactly the opposite, where actually people are becoming less racist and reacting to this sentiment in an American way. And what we've seen, for example, in attitudes on Islam, I've shown 7 consecutive polls from 2015 to now, where despite all of the anti-Islamic rhetoric that we're witnessing, all the anti-Islamic incidents that we're witnessing, the sense that this is the era of Islamophobia in America, that every single poll showed improvement in the attitudes toward Muslims from the one before. Every single one. And if you compare attitude toward Islam today, they're more positive than they were in 2015 because Americans, in the end, will reject this. And this is a moment, yes, one that we have to deal with, we have to address, but there is a path forward, and I think we shall overcome. And I say, all of us who have come from different parts of the world and have struggled to be here and have made it by some measures, with all of what was said today and all of what's happening around us in Washington and all of the rhetoric that we hear, this is home, and it's a good one. Thank you. Thank you very much.